Okay, so we're going into our last cultural condition that we really want to look at. And this one, a lot of times isn't included in sort of traditional plant cultural requirements, but I believe that it's super important to honor it as a cultural condition that we need to consider when we're considering what plants to use where. We have gone through so far cultural conditions that affect plant growth as water, nutrients, soil, climate, or temperature. We're going to go through space or room, or however you want to put it. Really, it's honoring the mature size of a plant. Now, this first one, light, I don't go through that one in terms of traditional presentation because it's relatively simple. We want to look at plants that, when we're looking at light, full sun, partial shade, full shade, deep shade, etc. Okay. Now, that one's relatively simple, but you do get into some nuances of that once we get into the classes that are plants identification and landscape design, etc. So let's go into cultural conditions, space or room. Give a plant the room that it needs. Okay. Plants naturally grow to a mature height and width. Acknowledge the intent of the planting and address it appropriately by selecting a plant that fits that space. Okay. Now, this is not a long presentation. It's, for the most part, it's relatively simple, but it dovetails into some more, some deeper issues that are going on. So first, we're going to go through selecting plants, appropriate plants for the space. Now, this picture I include because this is a very traditional approach to, excuse me, approach to planting. Right. Of course, this isn't on every single property, but the approach to plant selection, and ultimately, in this case, manipulation of plants to fit into a space that is either allotted or that is the intended visual appeal, is an interesting one to look at. So in this case, we see a very traditional use of boxwoods and roses. Okay. Now, these boxwoods here, I don't know exactly which boxwood they are, but they are a shrub. There are some smaller ones, there's some larger ones, some medium ones, etc. But these ones, part of the reason why the common name is boxwood is because they can be shaped into a box, which obviously is not the natural form of that plant. In order to achieve this, a plant is selected that is larger than the space that it's supposed to fill, and then it is pruned to fit this space. Now, pruning to fit the space using this method is less impactful or less harmful to the environment than using power tools. Okay, and we'll get into the use of power tools and sort of the negative impact on the environment that it has. So this again is a is a way that is achieved. Okay, you can achieve this by doing this. Now, there's lots and lots of plants out there that may not grow into box shapes, but there's lots of plants out there that fit into this overall size scheme that could achieve the same goal from a aesthetics and functional standpoint. Okay. Now, other situations, right? Selecting plants for space. This is a picture of some berberis or barberry. Berberis thunbergii purpurea is, I'm guessing, is what this one is. Now, this plant, you can see, grows to its natural size. It looks like it's not boxed, it's not sheared heavily. It is in its natural form, right? Clearly, it's adjacent to a road or some sort of walkway. And this Berberis thunbergii purpurea grows to a specific size, and it was selected to be able to fill this space with minimal pruning. This plant here, this is Carpentaria californica Elizabeth. I'll get into this one in a couple minutes more specifically, but this one is a plant that grows to 4 feet wide by 6 to 8 feet tall naturally. Okay, so you can see that within this space that it's planted, it can grow into that space without the need for excessive pruning or manipulation. We get into some ground covers. You see this one here is a Ceanothus. Oh boy, slipping my mind right now. Ceanothus griseus horizontalis, and it's one of the cultivated varieties. Okay, so in this space, this generally the Ceanothus horizontalis, griseus horizontalis, they typically will grow to a 2 to 3 foot height by a 4 to 8 foot width. Okay, so it will fill this space and this space without significant input, pruning, or manipulation. And that's really what we want to do, is really wise plant selection so that the overall maintenance requirements are reduced. The need for heavy pruning is reduced. And in a couple minutes, we will get into sort of the downfalls or the negative impacts that selecting plants for a space that is too small for the mature size of that plant, what actually happens with that. Here, we've got some Festuca idahoensis, okay, well planted, right? The on-center planting looks like about 18 inches to 24 inches on center, okay? And that is the approximate mature size of this plant. And so the space is filled very well without overcrowding. Now we're going to get into some plants and then some significant reasons why you would select a different type of plant. So here, this is Miscanthus sinensis, and I don't know which cultivated variety this is, but generally Miscanthus sinensis is most of the cultivated varieties, as well as the straight species, grow to a mature size of approximately 4 feet wide. Sometimes some of them wider, but approximately 4 feet wide by 4 to 6 feet tall. Okay, so it's a large grass. I believe in one of the previous presentations, I had noted I think in the flower presentation, you can spot a miscanthus sort of from a mile away because of its, maybe not a mile, but from a pretty far distance, because of its flower. Okay, because of this flower plume on here, it's really, really specific and characteristic of miscanthus. Great plant to use, very reliable. In most regions of California, it's either low or moderate water use. There's probably some regions where it's a higher water use, but great plant. Now, there are some downsides to this plant. And maybe the most significant downside to this plant is that it's notorious for its very sharp margins of the leaf. Okay, very sharp margins. And so it's really easy to get a grass cut, a grass blade cut. So if you walk closely to this one and it brushes up against your arm or leg and you're pushing into it well enough, then you're probably going to get kind of scraped up by it. So not a great plant to use adjacent to pathways where it will billow into the pathway. Not a great plant to use where there's children playing, right? They're going to want to run in and out of this, and they're going to end up with a bunch of grass cuts. So this, you can see the plume on it. This is one of the miscanthuses. And these are planted about a foot away from a walkway. And so you see how that needs to be pruned even in the months. This looks like it's probably nearing fall, this picture here. And the reason I say that is because it looks like some of these leaves up in this tree in the background are starting to turn some fall color. The miscanthus is a perennial grass, so it has a dormancy period during the winter. And so it gets cut all the way down to the ground, but remember, we don't want to cut into the crown because we'll damage its meristematic tissue and essentially ruin the plant. So at this point, really early fall, these should be, you can see that the plumes are turning some color, but they should be in full growth, just like this. But you can see what the landscape maintenance professional had to do is they had to prune it back because it was billowing into these walkways and making the walkways too narrow to walk through, but also sort of dangerous because they can actually cut you. Okay, so honoring the mature size of a plant is incredibly important because while this is a gorgeous, big, billowy, open, whimsical, moves and flows with the wind grass, if you place it in a spot in the landscape that doesn't allow for its mature size, it will need to be manipulated in such a way that you can never truly appreciate the actual form of that plant, right? This, I think by any stretch of the term, is not attractive, right? This does not scream beauty and open form. This is pruned and upright. And there's a lot of different plants that we could use that would fit that size. And more or less, or fit that space and more or less not have to be touched at all. So here it looks like it maybe comes into a bit of a triangle pie here. It looks like they wanted some height and some grass-like effects. And excuse me. And if we think back to some of the plants that we've talked about, right? One plant that would be perfectly easy to use and fit it would be that Callum-Grossus Carl Forster, right? 2.5, 3 feet wide max, lower foliage, very high plumes of flowers, but upright columnar size. And if this plant had been selected for this space, manipulation of that plant wouldn't have to happen. Okay, so plant selection for the allotted space, honoring the mature size of a plant, is outrageously important. So that being said, I gave an alternative here, and there's lots of different alternatives. Here we have a Muhlenbergia rigens, okay? Muhlenbergia rigens, California native. I think it spreads out into a bit of the Southwest as well, but it's California native. Deer grass, beautiful plant. Reason it's called deer grass is not because deer like to eat it, but actually because deer like to lie down in it. It's a comfy spot for them. So out in nature, you'll find Muhlenbergia rigens. If you run across it or like a grove of it or an open space with a lot of them, a lot of times you'll see that they're sort of pressed down or or it looks like they've been rolled on, and that's from deer. So Muhlenbergia rigens in the landscape generally will grow to about 4 feet wide by 4 feet tall, and the flower plumes on it will generally grow up to larger than that. Okay. Now, if you deprive this plant of water, and it is a low water use plant, if you deprive this plant of water, it'll stay on the lower end of its size range. If you give it ample water, the nice thing is so if you plant it in a garden setting where there's other plants that are maybe low or moderate water use plants, and it's receiving more supplemental water than it really needs, it doesn't complain or die like a lot of other plants. This one will just get larger. I've seen these things up to 5 feet by 5 feet. Okay. Now, this is a beautiful plant in terms of form, right? It's sort of a, hemisphere in terms of its foliage, but when its plumes pop up, it is just these long, beautiful, narrow spikes of flower plumes. Now, if you selected this plant and placed it into a space that wouldn't allow for that 4 feet by 4 feet to up to 5.5 feet by 5.5 feet when in bloom, then you would have to manipulate it in some fashion. And when you're manipulating a plant like this, it looks very goofy, right? I have seen it where people have literally just cut it by a third on one side because it's planted too close to a wall or a structure. Okay. So you completely lose the overall form and beauty of the plant by selecting that plant for a space that doesn't allow for its mature growth. So there's the aesthetic piece of manipulating a plant for to fit into its space, right? And there's some plants that it works with. There's some plants that it absolutely does not work with. Now, Muhlenbergia rigens, one of its cousins or brothers or something, right? Muhlenbergia dubia, which is pine muhly, native to southwestern United States, some pockets of California, but primarily Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. So another low water use plant. And to be honest, almost identical to Muhlenbergia rigens, but Muhlenbergia dubia maxes out its size at 3 feet tall by 3 feet wide to about 3.5 feet tall by 3 feet wide, 3.5 feet wide. Okay, so essentially the overall same plant, right? Of course, it's a different species, both within the same genus, but by really looking into the plant and honoring the size that it is, if you don't have the room for Muhlenbergia rigens, but you want the overall effect of Muhlenbergia rigens, there's a different plant for that. So having some significant plant knowledge is very important. Also, having a really good understanding of your resources is very important. It's very hard to keep all these plants in your head, right? To memorize or remember that there's a Muhlenbergia dubia and a Muhlenbergia rigens, and there's each and every different cultivated varieties of certain different plants, right? So really understanding your plant materials and your resources for searching for those plants so that you can make a wise selection is super important. So back to our Carpentaria californica, the straight up Carpentaria californica. This is a California native. I may or may not have already mentioned this one, but very interesting one. It's native to a very small select area, sort of east in the higher foothills and lower elevations of the mountains east of Fresno. in the hydrangea family. Very, very cool plant. One of my favorite natives to use. So Carpentaria californica grows to 6 feet wide, 7 feet wide, to about 6 to 8 feet tall. Okay, so works well in certain situations, right? Now, there's a cultivated variety that somebody found that happened to be growing much more narrow, but the same overall height as the Carpentaria californica straight up species. So the Carpentaria californica Elizabeth grows to 4 to 5 feet wide by 6 to 8 feet tall. Okay, so in this case, this looks like it sort of works. But if you're ever in a situation where you don't quite have the width, but you need the height out of a plant, then selecting a cultivated variety is a really good move. Here's another example of the same non-California native. This is a New Zealand native, Pittosporum tenuifolium. The one on the left here is more or less the mature size of the plant. To be honest, I've seen these plants get massive, almost tree-like. But generally, if you look it up, it's going to say that it grows to about 8 to 12 feet wide by about the same height or more. Okay, so about 15 to 18 feet tall. Okay, Pittosporum tenuifolium. Now, there's several cultivated varieties of Pittosporum tenuifolium. Here's 2 examples. Pittosporum tenuifolium golf ball grows to about, if you look it up, many resources say that it grows to about 3 feet by 3 feet, okay, which is great. And you see that here. It's actually larger. This looks more like it's about 4 feet by 4 feet. This one's about 4 feet by 4 feet. Now, this one next to it, the Pittosporum tenuifolium beach ball, grows to about 2 feet by 2 feet. Okay. The question may be, why is the golf ball larger than the beach ball? Well, the golf ball was put into production and for retail sale before the beach ball. And so they named it golf ball because it's significantly less large, or it's significantly smaller than the straight up species. Then the beach ball came along, and maybe they didn't want to call it marble or something. I don't know. Anyways, if you want this overall effect, right, the fine texture, the black stem, but you don't have room for this size plant, select the golf ball or the beach ball. Now, horticultural knowledge takes us a little bit further than this. The golf ball, and I believe the beach ball as well, if you look at, back to solar exposure and light, if you look at the solar needs of the Pittosporum tenuifolium, it will generate, in most resources, it will say that it can take full sun to partial shade. And it's true. It can take all of those without, any kind of, crazy reaching or anything weird about the plant trying to reach for light. Although, if you put a Pittosporum tenuifolium golf ball in full sun, it will generally grow to about 3 feet to 4 feet by 3 feet to 4 feet. If you put it in partial shade, it will grow much larger than that. So our observation of plants in the field and in different climates and different solar exposures is really important. Okay, but this is another example of one species and several different cultivated varieties that will fit a certain allowable space. Okay, and this is super important. So what are the drawbacks to not giving a plant enough room to actually grow into its mature size? Some of these we've talked about already. Increased maintenance activity. Okay, so of course, if you have to keep a plant at this size in this form. It's gonna require some significant maintenance, okay? Along with that significant maintenance, the general approach is to use gas-powered equipment, okay? Now, right now in California, there's a heavy transition by 2025 to transition to all electric maintenance equipment. Okay, they're banning the use of four-stroke engines, which are super, super bad for the environment. But those are the ones that are generally utilized in professional landscape maintenance activities, our hedging shears, our blowers, etc. And when you have to manipulate a plant and shear it into a hedge or a box or whatever you need, then using gas-powered equipment is sort of the general approach. Now, once things are transitioned over to electrical equipment, right, battery-powered equipment, there's still some significant impacts to the environment in that the mining for the metals that are used in batteries is significantly detrimental to the environment. Okay, so with increased maintenance activities, we just end up with higher emissions through the use of that maintenance equipment. Okay, the other thing that we end up with is higher organic material going to the landfill. Okay, higher organic material, higher amounts of organic material going to the landfill. I'll get into that in a second, the really significant impact of that and sort of what's been happening in order to circumvent that, and then what we can do to make sure that our horticultural knowledge is put into excellent use by selecting plants for the proper amount of space or the allowed amount of space. The last thing is it's a significant increased opportunity for disease. Anytime you're manipulating a plant outside of its natural form, you're stressing the plant. With that plant stress becomes greater opportunity for disease and pest pressure. So higher organics to the landfill. Ultimately, this is a significant issue, and it was addressed in 2016 by SB 1383. Governor Brown signed this into law in September of 2016. It established methane emission reduction targets in a statewide effort to reduce emissions of short-lived climate pollutants in various sectors of California's economy. How does that translate to horticulture? Here's how it translates. It established targets to achieve a 50% reduction in the level of statewide disposal of organic waste from the 2014 level by 2020, and then an additional 25% to bring it up to a full 75% by 2025. It gave CalRecycle the regulatory authority to actually achieve this organic waste disposal reduction target. So in looking at the 2014 levels, here's what we had in 2014. All materials going to the landfill in 2014, there was 41% that was organics, okay? So organics include food waste, landscape trimmings, including leaves, grass, trimmings, branches, stumps, etc., as well as non-hazardous food waste, okay? 7% of that was compostable paper. So compostable paper includes food soiled paper and other compostable paper. So the paper that the In-N-Out burgers wrapped up in, right? That's exactly what that is. Well, there's lots of other examples, but that's a pretty decent example that that we can get our heads wrapped around. I can. So ultimately, what happens is methane emissions. when organics, leaves, grass, trimmings, branches, stumps, go to the landfill and they get packed in with all other materials, they end up getting packed down within those other materials and some soil, etc. But it's compacted to a level where there's no oxygen. In anaerobic conditions, conditions without oxygen, we've talked about this before, right? We get bad bacteria, okay? We get bad biological life in terms of, may not be bad, they may not be horrible bacteria, but it's not beneficial for plant growth. The other really negative thing to it is that it has very high methane emissions. Now, methane is a greenhouse gas. It's talked about less than carbon because by volume, carbon is the most significant greenhouse gas. But methane, while it's not produced in such high volume as carbon dioxide, sorry, it is way more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of breaking down the ozone layer and impacting our climate. So there's a significant push to reduce the amount of methane emissions. So if you are selecting a plant to fit this space and you're constantly generating green waste unnecessarily, right? The only reason that the green waste is being generated in this case is because of the drive for the aesthetic value of this space. Along with that, yes, we can be wise with how we maintain that, but inevitably it's generating an amount of green waste that is unnecessary, and that green waste ends up going to our landfills. Okay. It's very important to select plants for our space from an aesthetic standpoint, but there's also a lot more dimension to it in that if we just go ahead and select a Carpentaria californica for a space that's 4 feet wide, inevitably that plant is going to have to be pruned excessively to be able to fit that space. Along with that excessive pruning, we get unnecessary organic waste. Along with that unnecessary organic waste, we end up with higher methane emissions. Okay, so this hits at a lot of different levels and a lot of different levels that most people don't usually think about. So how can we deal with this? So horticultural practices that help meet the mandates of SB 1383, there's a lot of them, but a couple we've already talked about. Grass cycling, right? So when you're grass cycling, you're not bagging that up and sending it off to the landfill. You're leaving it in place and leaving nutrients on the ground, organic matter on the ground to be eaten up by the biological life and utilized in that soil. So grass cycling helps with this. Using compost and mulch helps with this because at landfills, there's composting areas and mulch areas. You'll see at landfills now, there's heavy separation of all waste streams. And with that, they make compost, and there's a lot of compost producers. So we're taking that green waste and we're putting it back into the landscape, thus reducing our green waste going into the landfill permanently. Finally, selecting the right plant for the right place. Okay, so those are ways that we can have horticultural practices that help us to reduce methane emissions and reduce the effects of climate change. So this may be a little bit out of order, but this dovetails into what we'll be talking about in our next presentation. So to sort of recap all of this, choosing plants that grow to their natural size and shape. Okay, this is a very important piece. Selecting plants for the space that's allotted. So you always want to consider the plant's mature size in resource as well as in observation, because in some areas plants just grow larger depending on the climate or the solar exposure, etc. Okay. Avoid overplanting for instant effect. So instant effect, that's the typical model home syndrome where they pack in a bunch of plants so that it looks mature right off the bat. Don't do that. Honor the mature size of the plant. Select trees with a mature height that's appropriate for nearby power lines. Avoid shearing hedges. Prune properly and allow plants to grow to their natural shape. Now, this little set right here, two different conditions. This statement says, avoid doing this. You should do this. Now, this picture here, and I feel like it's a, kind of like the loam picture in the soils presentations, right? It's just, it's an extreme example, but it's a good example nonetheless. So this is an urban setting. It looks like this shrub is, being hedged to about 5 or 6 feet tall by maybe 4 feet wide. This is a rural setting. We've got some grasses and shrubs that look like they're growing to between 6 and 10, 12 feet tall by 8 to 10 feet wide minimum, right? Now, of course, I would love to always do this, but sometimes my condition is this, right? In this setting, you've got a sidewalk. You've probably got a fence behind it. You have a certain amount of width that you've got to grow a plant into and a certain height that you want that plant to get to for whatever kind of screening purposes are going on in this situation. Now, we can't exactly take these plants and place them here because we'd be under the same condition. This plant is called Xylosma congestum. Okay, it's I think glossy leaf Xylosma or just simply Xylosma. It naturally wants to grow to about 10 to 15 feet tall and wide. And actually it likes to just be kind of a big, very unique looking shrub, okay? It is capable of being hedged and sheared, and that's kind of like due to that it has lots of buds throughout its mature woody stems. And so as it's cut back, it will constantly generate new plant material. Now, this, let's say 12 feet by 12 feet plant is being maintained to a size that is 4 to 5 feet wide by about 6 feet tall. In order to do that, it's hedged at least monthly, okay, during the growing season, hedged at least monthly. And there's green waste being generated every time that happens. There's also emissions coming off of this equipment. If we selected these plants for this condition, we'd end up in the same situation because the natural form and size of this ceanothus is probably 10 feet wide by 6 to 8 feet tall. It hits the vertical size, but the width size is going to have to be manipulated constantly. So you need to look for an alternative. 4 to 6 feet wide, 4 or 5 feet wide by approximately 6 feet tall that never really has to be touched. Well, we already went through one of those. Carpentaria californica Elizabeth. 4 to 5 feet wide, 6 to 8 feet tall. Yes, you're going to need more of them in order to fill this space, but the overall maintenance on these will be significantly less because you essentially never have to touch them. You never have to shear them. You just allow them to grow into the mature size. And by doing so, by making a really wise selection like that, you end up reducing the amount of green waste going to the landfill and unnecessarily green waste being generated. And you reduce or eliminate the need for the use of landscape equipment that has really terrible emissions. there's a lot of other plants that will fit that size as well. Using your resources and honoring the mature size of plants, that's how you actually achieve that. Okay, so this, again, extreme example, but this is how we need to think about horticulture and plantings in the current state. So what are some other drawbacks of not having enough or giving enough room for a plant? Well, if we click on to this. So this right here is Camellia petal blight. We see this on Camellia a lot. This dovetails into the next presentation, which is IPM, Integrated Pest Management. This one is a common problem for camellias, right? It's Camellia japonica, obviously based on the name. It's of or from Japan. We have them, you know, they're planted almost everywhere, right? Within reason. Significant use of them in the Sacramento region, throughout much of California. They're wonderful because they're nice, large plants. They have beautiful flowers, etc. But there's this Camellia petal blight, okay? And what it is it is a fungus, okay? So the fungus makes it so that before the flowers are even open, they brown out and fall off, okay? Now, the way that we deal with this, there's some integrated pest management approaches, and here's solutions. You can click on this and dig into it a little bit better or a little bit more. But right here, plant camellias in well-ventilated location, okay? Well-ventilated location, good air circulation. When we treat plants like this, we get very low air circulation within that plant because we're creating a barrier here. With that barrier, we get reduced air circulation and increased instances for disease. And this Camellia petal blight is one of those diseases. Now, again, you can dig into this a little bit and see all the other things, the life cycle, et cetera, and how we stop Camellia petal blight. But one of the things is if you're hedging a camellia, inherently it's going to have reduced air circulation and increased opportunity for Camellia petal blight. Other really common pests that we end up with, powdery mildew, same kind of thing. Okay, we dive into powdery mildew and we get into management. Let's see here. Life cycle, ID and damage, management. Of course, there are a lot of plants that are hosts to powdery mildew and are susceptible to powdery mildew. And then you can select cultivated varieties that are resistant to powdery mildew, okay? Now, cultural practices, shade and moderate temperature favor most powdery mildews. Locate plants in sunny areas as much as possible. Provide good air circulation. Provide good air circulation. Same thing. If you are planting some plants that are susceptible, or even if they're not very susceptible to powdery mildew, but you are treating them like this, you're going to increase your opportunity for powdery mildew infestations. Okay, so here's a couple resources for you. So main point on this one is I strongly encourage you to use your horticultural knowledge and your knowledge of resources and your use of those resources to select plants that fit the space that they're allowed to grow into their mature size. Thank you.